I used to believe that if you loved your family enough quietly without asking for anything in return, they would notice. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. That illusion shattered the moment I read the words printed on my name tag, the old lady who's paying for everything. I froze. Not grandmother of the bride, not Mrs. Eleanor Wells. No, just that one sentence sharp as a needle and twice as cold. A joke, perhaps, but the kind that stings long after the laughter fades. I stood there, 67 years old, in my pale blue dress, with the pearl brooch Harold gave me on our last anniversary before the cancer came. My hair was pinned up like he always liked it, and I'd dabbed on the same soft lilac perfume he used to say smelled like spring. And there I was, reduced to a punchline on a piece of cardstock taped to my chest, like a label on a package someone else had paid to ship. No one batted an eye. Not my son, not his wife, not even my granddaughter, the bride. They were too busy posing for photos and sipping champagne to notice the humiliation burning beneath my skin. Or maybe they did notice and didn't care. If you've ever had a moment like that, where something small shattered everything you thought you knew, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I'd like to know how far stories like mine can still reach. You don't notice a candle burning down until the room goes dark. After Harold died, I stopped planning for myself. The cruise around Europe we had dreamed of cancelled. The brochures once taped to our fridge got tucked into a drawer with his obituary. I told myself there'd be time later. There's always time until there isn't. I sold my navy blue Buick, the one with heated seats and leather trim that Harold used to tease me for loving too much. That car knows your moods better than I do, he used to say. The money went toward my grandson's college tuition. When he got his acceptance letter, I cried. Not out of pride, but out of relief I could still be useful. Then came the wedding. Custom floral arches, a 12-piece string quartet, personalized menus printed on imported parchment. I never said no, not once. Every check I wrote felt like an act of devotion. Every wire transfers a quiet promise that they would feel loved even in Harold's absence. But love, it turns out, doesn't always echo back. I gave because I wanted them to thrive, but somewhere along the way I stopped noticing how hollow I'd become. Like a candle that burns down to its base, wax-melted work spent still trying to light the room for everyone else. And no one thought to ask if I was warm. She's basically their walking ATM. The words weren't meant for me, but they found me anyway. I was standing near the edge of the ballroom, sipping lukewarm champagne, pretending to admire the ice sculpture of swans in the center of the buffet. The kind of silence that only happens in a crowded room wrapped itself around me, and in that stillness, their voices slipped through. A group of young guests, maybe friends of the groom, chuckled behind me. Pamela said her mother-in-law insisted on covering everything. Venue, dress, even the honeymoon, probably. Must be nice to have an open wallet in a blue dress. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, staring at the ice as it slowly melted into a puddle at its base. Like me, once elegant, now dissolving into something shapeless, unnoticed. And the worst part, my own son and daughter-in-law were nearby, laughing along. Richard the boy I held through night terrors. Pamela, the woman I once brought chicken soup to when she was sick long before they married. They didn't defend me. They didn't deny it. They just let the story stand. That night I didn't feel like a mother, or a grandmother. I felt like a balance sheet, a line item. At what point does love stop being love and start being a transaction? When do warm gestures become cold currency? I had given them everything except a reason to respect me. And maybe that was my mistake. Some knives don't cut. They simply reveal where you've already been bleeding. Just after the toasts were done and the cake had been served, I slipped away to the restroom not to freshen up, but to breathe, to exist somewhere outside the noise. I was blotting my lipstick in the mirror when the door cracked open, then closed again. A hesitant knock followed. Mrs. Wells. It's Thomas Halbrook Harold's attorney. May I have a moment? I stepped out. Thomas looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing more clearly now. He held a thin envelope worn at the edges, like something that had waited too long to speak. "Your husband left instructions. A codicil," he said softly. "He asked me to deliver it only if I ever believed you were being disrespected by your family." I opened it with steady hands. Legal language, precise and cold, but its meaning was scorching. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me verbally, financially, or otherwise would forfeit their share of Harold's estate. No courtroom, no debate. Just a line drawn in ink across the future. I stood in that hallway, the laughter from the ballroom floating faintly through the walls, and I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time in years, someone had seen this coming and loved me enough to protect what I couldn't yet admit was under attack. I folded the paper slowly and whispered, "Let's see how far they'll go." It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. Right after Harold's funeral, there was warmth. My son Richard called every night. Pamela brought over lasagna I didn't ask for. I thought, maybe grief has brought us closer. Then came the first favour. Mum, Richard said one evening, his voice syrupy with concern, "I've been thinking about starting my own business, something Dad would have supported. I just need a little seed money to get going. $10,000. That was the first check. After that, it became routine. New countertops, a car upgrade, Jennifer's college textbooks. Then her spring break trip. Each time the tone was the same, gentle, rehearsed, wrapped in the kind of gratitude that fades before the ink on the check dries. When I hesitated, once Pamela leaned in, all softness and suggestion. "Eleanor, have you ever considered downsizing? The house is so big for one person. Sunrise Acres has lovely views, and it's safer. Safer." As if I'd suddenly become a hazard to my own staircase. The calls stopped being about me and started being about money. They never asked how I slept at night. If the silence in my bed had grown heavier since Harold passed. If I still cooked dinner for 2 out of habit. No, what they wanted to know was, had the market value of my home gone up? My love, it seemed, had been quietly entered into a family spreadsheet, not under gratitude, but under available assets. You all heard it. She's sending them to Bali. Pamela's voice rang out like a toast, but it wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction sealed without consent. We were seated in the sunroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club, soft music playing, forks tapping against porcelain. I had just lifted my coffee cup when she made the announcement. A huge thank you to Grandma Eleanor. She beamed, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder. She's gifting Jennifer and Mark their dream honeymoon. The room erupted in polite claps. Champagne glasses clinked. My hand froze mid-air. I hadn't agreed to any of it. I set my cup down slowly and deliberately, letting the silence crawl in behind me. Then I looked at my granddaughter, radiant and hopeful. At her new husband, quietly stunned. And finally, at Pamela, smiling like the puppet master who thought she'd just pulled the perfect string. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." I said, my voice calm but razor-edged. "This is the first time I'm hearing of a honeymoon to Bali. I said I'd think about it. And I'm still thinking." Laughter faded. A few guests exchanged looks. Richard leaned in and whispered, "Mum, don't make a scene." I turned to him and said evenly, "I don't sign checks based on someone else's emotions, especially not the ones I didn't cause." At that moment, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. By myself. For the first time in a very long time. I should have said something. I should have stopped it. Those were the first words out of Ethan's mouth when I opened the door. No hello. No hug. Just the raw guilt of a young man whose silence had started to feel like betrayal. It was the day after the brunch, and the house was still heavy with echoes, voices that had laughed too loud, hands that had clapped for money I hadn't offered. But Ethan's presence cut through it like sunlight through storm glass. He stepped inside and wrapped me in a hug that didn't ask for anything. That alone made it different. We sat in the kitchen where I'd once taught him how to stir cookie dough without flinging half of it onto the cabinets. He looked older now, broad-shouldered, thoughtful. But his eyes still held that same gentle blue, the kind that sees before it speaks. I heard what they said at the brunch, he murmured. And at the wedding. I saw the name tag. I saw how they treated you. And I didn't do anything. You're doing something now, I said, pouring tea into mismatched mugs. He looked down at his hands. I don't want to be like them. And just like that, something in me softened. Not everything was lost. Not everyone had forgotten who I was beyond a checkbook. Maybe in the fog of greed, there was still one lighthouse flickering on. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan was the piece of family that hadn't yet been bought. She's not thinking clearly anymore. We need to talk about guardianship. Richard didn't shout it. He didn't need to. He said it with the calm, measured tone of someone who believes he's doing the right thing and expects applause for it. It was my 68th birthday, my home, my dining table. The peach cobbler is still warm, the candles on the cake have just blown out. And suddenly the son I raised was standing in front of family and friends, gently suggesting I no longer be trusted with my own life. The room froze, like breath held too long. I'm only saying this because I care, he added. She's giving away money to open a bookstore, taking painting classes and refusing reasonable advice. It's concerning. I looked at the faces around the table. Some avoided my gaze. Others looked confused, a few pitying. But then I caught Ethan's eyes. He wasn't confused. He was furious. I think she's finally living, he said, voice firm, and maybe that scares you because it means she doesn't need your permission anymore. Richard scoffed. This is about protecting her. No, it wasn't. It was about control, about keeping the faucet open, about cutting off the voice that had for once begun to speak. And I realized at that moment, this wasn't just about disrespect. It was about erasure. They didn't want me to be irresponsible. They wanted me to be invisible. I believe this is the appropriate moment, I said, folding my napkin and placing it beside my untouched plate. Then I looked across the room at Thomas Halbrook, my late husband's attorney, seated quietly in the corner, like a man waiting for a storm to finish before stepping into the light. He rose without a word and reached into his leather briefcase. The room, once buzzing with Richard's accusations and Pamela's nervous laughter, fell into a stillness so dense it hummed. This Thomas began holding up a folded document, is a legally binding codicil to Mr. Harold Wells's will, executed 2 years before his passing. It was to remain private unless Mrs. Eleanor Wells was ever publicly disrespected or humiliated by a family member. You could hear the air shift. Forks stilled, smiles vanished. He continued, his voice clear and unwavering. It states that any descendant who treats Mrs. Wells with cruelty, entitlement, or coercion, particularly regarding her finances, will forfeit their entire inheritance, effective immediately. Pamela's face turned pale. Richard blinked like he hadn't understood English. I sat still. Not smug, not triumphant, just steady. Because this wasn't revenge. It was a line drawn in quiet ink long before today by the only man who had truly seen me. They thought my silence had been a weakness, but it was a test. And now they had failed it publicly and irrevocably. How could you do this to us? Richard's voice cracked as he stood face red with disbelief, arms flailing like a child denied a toy he was certain was his. Pamela sat frozen beside him, her wine glass trembling slightly, her perfectly powdered face suddenly much too pale. I didn't answer right away. Because it wasn't me who had done this. It was them. Every smirk, every manipulation, every whispered comment behind my back, they had written their own ending. I had simply turned the page. Thomas cleared his throat. According to the terms of the codicil, their shares in the estate are now nullified. Half will remain with Mrs. Wells, and the other half will be reallocated. He turned to Ethan, to the one person who showed this woman respect when it wasn't easy or convenient. Your grandfather would have been proud. Ethan looked stunned. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes met mine, not with greed, not even with joy, just awe, as if he had watched justice take human form and walk into our dining room. I didn't feel victorious. There were no trumpets, no cheers, no cinematic swelling of music, just a quiet, almost holy sense of balance being restored. For once, the right person had been seen, and the wrong ones could no longer pretend they hadn't looked the other way. It didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace, wearing its proper name. Fairness. You don't notice how heavy something is until you finally set it down. In the weeks after that night, I did things no one expected of me, least of all myself. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center where I painted lemons and wildflowers like they held secrets. I joined the Tuesday yoga group for seniors. My hips protested, but my heart softened. I helped Ethan secure a small storefront downtown. It would become a bookstore and cafe. Cozy shelves, hand-picked titles, a little corner for children's story time. No grand ribbon cuttings, just quiet beginnings, the kind that grow with care, not capital. I took a train up the coast, rented a room with lace curtains and an ocean view, ate alone in a restaurant with linen napkins and soft jazz playing overhead. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel lonely. I didn't need to be anyone's benefactor, or bank, or backup plan. I was just Eleanor, and that somehow was finally enough. When you pour out the dirty water, there's finally room for clean tea. If you've ever had to relearn your worth in the place you once called safe, if you've had to rebuild yourself from inside the walls that once held you down, tell me your story in the comments. And let me know what city you're watching from, so I can see how far stories like ours still travel. They named her Grace Haroldine, after the man who built this family, and the silence that almost broke it. 1 year had passed. I was standing near the back of Ethan's bookstore, where the morning light slanted just right across the oak floors. My painting, a field of marigolds, hung quietly on the far wall, framed not for sale but for memory. The bell above the door chimed, and in walked Jennifer. Older now. Softer, maybe. In her arms, a baby wrapped in a quilt I'd once stitched for her when she was still small enough to believe in lullabies. She smiled when she saw me. "Grandma, meet Grace." I reached for the child, who blinked up at me with eyes that didn't know betrayal or inheritance or the weight of expectations. Just trust. Behind the counter, Ethan arranged books for a local poetry reading. His hands moved with calm purpose, like someone who knew exactly where he belonged. I looked around this little store, coffee mugs stacked by the register, potted plants in the windows, a shelf marked staff picks, with a handwritten sign in Ethan's careful lettering. This wasn't just a bookstore, it was a second chance. I used to believe family was defined by blood and birthdays. But now I know it's built with respect, with boundaries, with people who see your worth even when you're not holding a checkbook. Give with an open heart, but never so much that you disappear inside the giving. That's the lesson. And somehow that's freedom.